Well, welcome, and thanks for joining us for Thursday Night Live. We are back after a summer hiatus, my name is Brennan Barnard. I'm the Director of College Counseling at the Derryfield School in New Hampshire, and also the College Admission Program Advisor at Making Caring Common at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and the co-author of The Truth About College Admission, A Family Guide to Getting In and Staying Together with Rick Clark at Georgia Tech. And I am so pleased. First of all, I want to let people know that this is being recorded, and we will send a recording out as a follow-up, and it's being streamed live on Facebook. And I want to just take a moment and thank our collaborators at Grown and Flown for sponsoring this with us. And we're going to be bringing you a series of events over the next couple months, and I will speak a little more to that at the end. But we have a rock star group of authors with us tonight, good friends and authors that have books either just have come out or will be coming out about college admission. And I will take a moment here and introduce them each. First, we have Melissa Korn. Melissa is a co-author of Unacceptable: Privilege, Deceit, and the Making of the College Admissions Scandal. She's a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in New York, covering higher education, and previously she wrote for Dow Jones Newswires. Welcome. And then we have Jacques Steinberg, who is the author of Who Gets In and Why: A Year Inside College Admissions. He has written about higher education for 2 decades. He is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, and a contributor to The Atlantic and The Washington Post, and a special advisor for innovation at Arizona State University. He also co-hosts the podcast Future You. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Brennan.
And finally, Jacques Steinberg. He's the co-author of The College Conversation, a practical companion for parents to guide their children along the path to higher education. He is also the author of The Gatekeepers: Inside the Admissions Process of a Premier College, a New York Times bestseller. Jack is a former New York Times national education correspondent and is a member of the board of directors of the National Association for College Admission Counseling. And he has served as a senior executive of Say Yes to Education, a national nonprofit college access organization. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Brennan.
And just a little tidbit, we were talking earlier, Jack started the Choice blog at the New York Times back just about a decade ago, and or a little over a decade ago, and that's where I got my chops starting writing, and so thank you, Jack. Things come full circle here. So I just want to take a moment, and maybe Melissa, we'll start with you. I just want to get you each to say a little bit about your book, and what it covers, what the approach is, and then we'll dig into some questions.
Sure. So the book is about the Varsity Blues college admissions cheating scandal. Came out this summer. And we go into kind of the backstory of Rick Singer, the mastermind of this whole scheme, what it was all about. And it also talks about college admissions at large and what systems exist and existed that allowed this whole scandal to happen, where the weaknesses were, where the inequities already were that were exploited. And then we also spend a fair bit of time talking about the parents and the families involved in this, and this fairly warped worldview of a short list of what made a good college and why there was this misunderstanding of what success looks like in the admissions process.
Great, thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, and thanks for having us all here, Brennan. So Who Gets In and Why, A Year Inside College Admissions, really got its inspiration from Jack, who did this fantastic book, as you mentioned earlier, called The Gatekeepers, now I guess about 20 years ago, right, Jack? And so I reread that book a couple of years ago because it's a book when I was at the Chronicle of Higher Education, like it was kind of assigned reading when you walked in the door, to kind of really understand how higher education and particularly admissions works. And when I reread it a couple of years ago, still a great book, but I realized probably some things have changed. You know, the growth of the Common App, which was still big back then, but much bigger now, but, you know, online apps. And I also wanted to expand it and look at both publics small liberal arts colleges, big private. So I look inside the process at 3 different institutions: Emory, Davidson, and the University of Washington, and then kind of look at the larger ecosystem. So I followed a couple of kids who were applying everywhere, and then also looked at the history of the rankings, of direct mail, of the testing agencies, and all these people who pull levers in the background that parents and students never see, but have a huge influence over who gets in and why.
Great, thanks. And Jack, what do you have for us? I know the one thing that has changed since the Gatekeepers is maybe a little more gray in your beard, right?
We're going to start that this early, huh? I guess the audience is going to see that. I do sort of feel like the wise old person of this. But first of all, thank you, Brennan, to you and Grown and Flown for doing this and for demystifying the process. And I'm so truly honored to be on this panel with Melissa and Jeff, who have taught me so much. This most recent book, The College Conversation, happens to be true. What I'm about to say is I was on a college tour with my son 3.5 years ago, and my cell phone rang, and on the other line was Eric Furta, the Dean of Admission at the University of Pennsylvania, who is a source to all of us, I think, on this panel. It's among many people who sort of explain this process to us. And Eric said, we should write a book. And I said, oh, what should that book be? And he said, it should be a book for parents to help shed light on this process, explain it to them, and try to give parents a framework to have a series of conversations with their children, not just about the mechanics of the process, but to sort of pan back. What does it mean? What do you as a child value? How do I as a parent even ask you what you value? What do you aspire to? And how might you graft that into the process? And so that's really where it began. If we had a few role models for the book, and one of them was the book, What to Expect When You're Expecting. Obviously a really, really high bar to set, impossible bar to reach. But what if you wrote What to Expect When You're Expecting for parents going through the college search process?
Great, thanks. And I've read all these, and you read all 3 of these books and you have a comprehensive understanding of college admission in this day and age and what to expect. So I highly recommend all 3 of these books. I wish I was like Oprah and I could give everyone that was watching a copy of each book, but no can do. So I would love to, why write about higher education of all things that you could write about? Why write about college admission? Why write about higher education? Jeff, do you want to start?
So I actually have been kind of a higher education geek for quite some time. In college, I interned at U.S. News and World Report on the college rankings back in the early 1990s. And I kind of got a bug at that time. And I talk about this in the book. Al Sanoff, Mel Elfin, who were kind of the deans of the college rankings back then, kind of really instilled this bug in me. And my first job was at the Ithaca Journal, covering Cornell and Ithaca College, where Melissa went to Cornell, I went to Ithaca College. So, I kind of got the bug being in a college town. And so eventually got to the Chronicle. And one of the Chronicle of Higher Education, and one of the things that I've come to realize about admissions in particular is that it really is a sorting mechanism. Unfortunately, I think in some cases, for many other parts of life. I know from the last book when I was looking at the hiring process after college, right, there are some big firms out there that will only go to certain colleges to recruit for employees, and mainly because they trust the admissions office made the right decision, quote unquote, right decision 4 years earlier. And in reporting this book, I've been always fascinated by what a bunch of authors over the years who've written admissions books have found. And it's kind of our fascination with selective colleges in particular, because we all know on this call, right, average acceptance rate at American colleges and universities is 65%, right? There's only a couple hundred really highly selective colleges in the country. Most people don't go to a selective college. I didn't go to one. I didn't grow up where people just talked about selective colleges all the time. And so my goal, at least in the last couple of years, has been, I think the goal of many of us has been to try to lower the temperature a little bit, lower the anxiety rate around higher education. I'm not quite sure we've succeeded, but I'll keep trying.
Great. Jack?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, went to a public high school where somehow I knew that half the students in my graduating class did not go on to four-year college. Many of them were first-gen immigrants from the Azores in Portugal. And I got into a college that my guidance counselor told me not to apply to, not just, you know, don't get your hopes up, don't apply. And it's not like this process tells us why someone gets in or why they don't. And I guess in many ways, my whole career, in some ways like Jeff's, has been trying to answer that question of how do these decisions get made and on what basis? And I sort of haven't lost that curiosity of an 18-year-old who was kind of bewildered by this process, and as well as you know, the proxy of my own parents as well. And that's sort of what drives my work.
Let me know when you figure it out. Melissa, what do you have to add?
Yeah, so I've always covered some element of higher ed since I got into journalism. I think writing about colleges is very relatable. Our readers went to college themselves, want to go to college, are helping put their kids through college, are helping their kids navigate the process, or their grandkids, are paying off loans, are hiring college grads. So my readers are at the Journal are very interested in higher education, kind of in all its forms. I think I've gravitated towards writing about college admissions because it is this baffling, bewildering process that seems to bring even the most level-headed, smart individuals to their knees. And you know, you can talk to parents who are CEOs of companies or who are neurosurgeons who, as soon as it comes time to help their kid go figure out where to go on a college tour, they become inarticulate, you know, jello, just nervous people who cannot understand the process. It's changed so much since they did it. And I think trying to shed a little light, give a little bit of transparency into what is otherwise a very complicated and seemingly high stakes decision, I hope to try to do that occasionally.
That's great. And I'd love to dig into this issue of transparency a little, or maybe a lot, because, you know, we talk a lot, and especially in my work with Making Caring Common, we talk a lot about democratizing information. How do we get out, and I know, Jack, this is something that you were really working with at Say Yes, just how do we get out really good quality information to families of all backgrounds, and all means about college admission, and how do we get good information about college search and about the way the admission experience works. So what needs to be more transparent about college admission? What are ways that that college admissions offices, that counselors can be more transparent in this experience? Jack, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things is something that all you know, four of us on this panel do, and that families can do a version of as well, is going to credible sources and trying to be good consumers of credible information that is informed by the folks in many cases who are doing this work. And I think for the most part, and there are certainly exceptions in all of the books that we've written and stories we've written, but for the most part, the people who do this work, admissions and counseling, are doing it because they care about issues of access and making it possible for student success, and talking to a range of people who have firsthand knowledge of the process, as opposed to those who, you know, perhaps represent that they do, but maybe when you dig a little deeper, not so much. I also, you know, somebody like Eric Furta, you know, the Dean of Admission at the University of Pennsylvania, who is my co-author, Rick Clark, your co-author, Brennan, who's the Dean of Admission at Georgia Tech. I give credit for those guys. I mean, they're not, at least in our two experiences, there to tell secrets, but they are there, to use Melissa's word, to shed light. And I think more folks like them could do some good.
Yeah. Melissa, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think when, you know, the best, or the worst thing a family could do, I'll start with the worst part. The worst thing parents and a teen can do as they're starting to navigate this process is look at college rankings and then stop. To think that college rankings are the end all be all kind of guide to how to figure out where to apply. Because rankings all measure different things. A lot of them focus more on inputs than on outcomes. I say this as somebody whose own publication does annual college rankings, and I've been part of them. But the best school for Johnny is not the best school for Jimmy. And I don't even know what the best means, right? So a school that is ranked number 7, is that really better than a school that is ranked number 17? Probably not. So really digging into the nuance of what the family wants, what the student wants, what their goals are in a college education, in getting a college education. You don't get that just looking at a list of the top 50 whatever schools. So I think the worst thing you can do is stop at the rankings. The best thing you can do is, if you are fortunate enough to have a college counselor at your high school who knows their job, rely on them, work with them. And I know that not every student is that fortunate to have a college counselor that actually has time to sit down with them and get to know them. Find a different mentor to help through this process. It doesn't have to be a parent. It could be, an older sibling, a cousin, a teacher, a coach. There's always somebody there who has been through the process and can help guide you. You don't have to do it totally blind.
That's great. Yeah, I could go on about rankings all evening. It is my my mission in life to bring down the rankings. But and Jeff, I know you dig into the rankings a good bit in your book, and you were obviously embedded in U.S. News and World Report from the beginning. But any thoughts on just not necessarily about the rankings, but just transparency? What needs to be more transparent in college admission?
I mean, it's pretty hard. I think that parents want and students want certainty in especially right now, in a very uncertain world. I'm sure we'll get questions like this tonight, especially around test optional. And one of the questions I keep hearing in the last couple of weeks is, well, if I don't have a test score, how do I know where to apply? Because I want to know where I fit in that, middle 50%, right? So you're making decisions based on that test score, and you think that test score is going to get you in, right? If you're in that range. And and the central thesis of my book is nothing that surprises people in admissions, but admissions is not about the applicant, it's about the institution and the institutional priorities and needs. And every institution has different priorities and needs, which is why this is not a system. So you could apply to 10 different schools and they have 10 different priorities. And it's up to the admissions office to really put forth those priorities in the admissions process. And so I kind of feel like admissions officers and even deans are in really tough positions because they're being told from people above them kind of what the needs are. We need more full pay students, or we need more diversity, or whatever it might be. We need to fill all the team sports and things like that. And I think that makes it an impossible job. And then parents on the other side want this transparency. They want these answers. And it's really fascinating. And I mentioned this in the book, and I think it was in 1956, the requirements to get into the University of California system were a paragraph long, just outlined exactly what you needed to get into the University of California system. Today, those spread over like 7 web pages if you go to Berkeley or UCLA. And even at the end, it basically says, if you follow these things, we still follow a holistic system, and you're not guaranteed to get in. Right. And that's what parents and students want. They want a guarantee, and there's no such thing as a guarantee in college admissions. And so I think we're always going to be in this elusive search for transparency when it just doesn't, it's almost impossible.
Those were also the days, by the way, that students went into their counselor and the counselor just kind of slid, 3 names across to them, right? And said, these are the schools you're going to apply to. And then got on the phone with the dean of admission and said, these are the students I'm sending you this year. Right.
Yeah, I mean, and there were obviously a lot fewer students applying to the University of California in the 1950s, right? We have a very different system with very different social goals right now too, which I think is good. So, but it's just interesting about what parents, I think, and students want when they say transparency. I think sometimes that's a guarantee, which is almost impossible.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd love to get into some of the questions, and thanks for folks who are throwing things in the chat, and please continue to do so. I'd love to dig in a little more to this question about how do you recommend in the work you've done, how do you recommend students and families look into outcomes, kind of determine outcomes at schools, and rankings so often are based on inputs, and what are good ways to, Melissa, do you want to address that?
Sure. So that is the one plug I'll give for the journal rankings, is they do look at outcomes. Jeff is laughing.
I have the ability to mute you here, Melissa.
No, I think when we talk about outcomes, there's a few different ways. You can look at graduation rates, but the Department of Education college scorecard often looks at 8-year graduation rates. Is graduating from a bachelor's degree program, if you're attending full-time in 8 years, really considered success? I'm not sure. So you want to look at 4- and 6-year graduation rates, not just 8-year rates. The schools themselves can have those, or the Department of Education, you can find those. Looking at debt at graduation, debt 10 years on, salaries. The perhaps most obvious place to look, and perhaps least helpful place to look, is on the school's career services websites, where they will list a first destination survey. So outcomes, how many of our graduates have jobs within 6 months of graduation? Well, if a large share of students go on to grad school, it's not really that meaningful a number. The response rate for those surveys are often abysmal. So you can have, 15, 20% of grads responding, and then the school is boasting on its homepage about how 90% of their grads have jobs. Well, chances are the people who have jobs are the ones who want to tell you about them. So that is not helpful, but it's the easiest one to find. So looking at actual graduation rates, looking at salaries, looking at debt burdens, and looking at debt burdens in the context of salaries, right? If somebody's earning 6 figures, but they have 80 grand in debt, that 80 grand doesn't look as outrageous as if they're earning 30 grand and have 80 grand in debt. So I think outcomes, there's a bunch of ways to measure it, right? Are you looking just at salary? Are you looking at impact on the world? What kinds of jobs do people go into? What kinds of job careers are they in 10 years out? And there are ways to find those. Department of Education website is a good first step for some of the more quantitative measures.
Jeff, do you have anything to add based on some of your other books and some of your other looking at data and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think Melissa's definitely right about the first destination surveys. It's almost impossible to find one that has like an under 90% placement rate. First of all, if they do have under 90%, they're not going to advertise it. I think you want to, when you go to colleges, you want to ask, where are students interning? Where are they getting jobs? I think you want many examples, and examples in the departments that you want to study in, right? In the majors you want to study in. Every college out there advertises its most successful alums. But I want to know, where do the average students go every year? Where do they intern, and where do they work? The other thing I think you want to ask about outcomes is around whether it's graduation rates or retention rates. And schools can do this. You want to ask about, what about students like me, right? So if you're on financial aid, retention and graduation rates differ between men and women, right? They differ between first generation students and non-first generation students, between different races and ethnicities. So you want to be more specific when you're asking that question, is what about people like me? How do they succeed here?
Thanks. Jack, do you want to, what conversations do you recommend that that parents have with their kids around outcomes?
I mean, I think, first of all, I agree with not only looking at some of the outcome data on first jobs and salaries, what have you, and definitely disaggregating by major, as was mentioned, if they will do that, because as was said, that can vary. But at the risk of recommending another book, the book Colleges That Change Lives really has as its DNA this question of not what was the average or median SAT score or grade point average of the kids coming into the school, but what was the student experience while they were there, and that what then happened after they left. And that approach can be modeled by families as they go to group information sessions and tours, whether online or in person. There's also something called the National Survey of Student Engagement, NSSE. And it values things and counts things like asking students, how accessible were your professors during office hours? How easy was it to raise a hand in class and be called on? Some of these sort of softer variables that, depending on what your child is looking for in a college experience, can be helpful, provided the colleges will share that data with you. But it's certainly worth asking the question.
Thanks. And Colleges That Change Lives has a great website too, that based the organization that was based off of Pope's book. And I'll put that in the chat.
I'd also throw out there that another thing to look at, kind of along what Jacques was saying, was the Gallup Purdue kind of, it's not where you go, it's how you go, right? So looking at what the outcomes were based on some of that, you can see what types of questions to be asking. Some of those types of questions that Jacques just said, like, those are such important questions to be asking on a college tour, if you're able to physically go on a college tour these days. Otherwise, when you're talking in an info session, a virtual info session, talking to current students, former students.
Great, thanks. So do you want to, Melissa, I saw you were saying that question about Varsity Blues and the mission scandal, and Jeff and Jack, feel free to weigh in, but has anything really changed since? And I know you were in another webinar earlier this week talking about this, but just kind of in a nutshell, have things changed in admission?
Yeah, so the final chapter of our book is titled "A System Reformed?" So I think that probably gives away the answer a little bit. I don't really think that very much has fundamentally changed because of that scandal. I think in the immediate aftermath, we saw some schools say, we're going to audit applications a little bit more. We're going to check and make sure that some more of the material is accurate. We will make sure that somebody who is recruited and enrolled as an athlete actually joins the team. And if they're not on the roster, find out why, which apparently schools hadn't been doing before, at least in the kind of the kind of lower tier, secondary non-revenue sports. But we did not see a ton of schools come out and say, we are never going to pay attention to donations ever again, or athletes have absolutely no additional sway, or they don't get a special path to admission anymore. That there was none of that really fundamental change. I think there was discussion of it and some moments of introspection and reflection, and I had some warm fuzzy feelings occasionally when I would speak to schools. But frankly, then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden the needs and concerns of schools changed dramatically. And you now have schools with such core financial crises that I think it'll be even harder for some of them to turn away from a student who's full pay, let alone a student who's full pay and their family is signaling that they can, drop a 6-figure or 7-figure donation once the kid gets in. So maybe a few years from now we'll see more, but if the Harvard admissions trial and Varsity Blues didn't really change things, I don't know that we're going to really walk away from development candidates and VIP lists and legacy admissions. And I say this all a little sadly, because I think that it's an opportunity to have really fundamental reform. And for many schools, we haven't seen it.
Thanks. And from the Harvard trial, you're talking about the trial on race and admission.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned the pandemic, of course. I mean, Jeff, Jack, I mean, do you think things are going to change significantly because of the pandemic, kind of long term? I mean, obviously we've seen just in this year a number of schools go test optional. I mean, the majority of schools go test optional. Some go test blind. There's news out from about this lawsuit in California right now that is kind of potentially forcing the UC schools to go test blind, meaning they will not use testing in admission at all for the coming year. Other smaller schools and other schools like Dickinson College just went test blind today. So, I mean, there are changes happening, but do you see any kind of systematic long-term changes?
I think that all of us should be careful anyone who, pretends to have a crystal ball. I mean, the scrambling that is going on in college admissions offices right now, as bewildered as we are as parents and as our students are as applicants, the admissions officers themselves, anybody who's being honest with you, will tell you that they're figuring it out as they go along. And in one sense, that's unsettling, surely, if you're a student who's in the application pool this year in particular. But I do think that we have to, all of us as parents, have to take a longer view that, that this will pass at some point, that this is not the process as it's going to be for the long haul. But the test optional piece is fascinating. You had Angel Perez, the new CEO of the National Association of College Admission Counseling, on whose board I serve, come out in an op-ed in the Hartford Courant last week saying colleges' test optional policy should be made permanent. Why are we outsourcing to a third party judgments of the admissibility of our young people? And I'd be curious what you, Jeff, and Melissa think about to what extent Angel, as the head of an association of thousands of admissions officers and thousands of college counselors, a call like that, what impact might it have, and what might it signal, in addition to things that are happening in California, for example?
Jeff?
Yeah, Brennan, I think Jack's right. I think, it's all of our crystal balls are very cloudy right now. That said, I think that this is an incredible moment for higher education right now overall, and for admissions in particular. I think testing is one thing that's going to be hard to put the genie back in the bottle at many schools. I think some schools will go right back as soon as they can, just because it's in their DNA. But I think at a number of schools, they're going to see the place didn't fall apart because they didn't require testing. They were still able to get a class that they're satisfied with. And because I think so many students, right, even in the test optional world, as you well know, I was talking to Nondorf at Chicago the other day. I think something like, even they've been test optional for a couple of years, but still, 85% of students submitted scores, right? Well, this year, I think even at the test optional schools, because it's so difficult to take the test this year, I think the percentage of students actually submitting is going to be much lower at many schools. And so I think you're going to for the first time, really see what it's like to admit a class without test scores. And I think when they see the place didn't fall apart, I think that we're going to see many schools not go back. There's one other thing, though, that I think is critical here. It's about the application overall, because it's not just the test score that I think is going to be hard for schools to get from students this year, right? But as we all well know, I mean, many schools are going pass fail, or they went pass fail last spring. We have a bunch of schools, some virtual, some face-to-face, some hybrid, right? There's so much variation this year in all the assets that typically come with the application, that I think it's going to force schools to figure out what really matters. Because so often I think there's just been application bloat, and not just in numbers, but in what we've been asking students for, just more and more stuff. And this year, a lot of that stuff just can't be provided, or won't be provided in the volume it has been in the past. And I'm hopeful that perhaps schools will say, you know what, maybe we don't need, 2 essays, and maybe we don't need 3 recommendations. Maybe we don't need all these things. Maybe 1 or none will do. And perhaps there will be a reckoning to come in a year or two about the application itself.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of questions coming through in the chat and on Facebook about kind of how colleges are going to make decisions without testing and things like that, and is GPA going to be more important? I mean, of all the conversations I've had with admission deans, and I'm sure it's similar with you all, that course program and academic performance has always been kind of the most important. And it's not like colleges are going to be making decisions in a void. I mean, they have a lot of information to go on. I had a really great conversation. I was doing a webinar with Matt Hyde, who's at Lafayette College, who's the VP there, and he was just showing me and showing the group we were presenting to a list of cognitive and non-cognitive abilities and strengths that they will be looking for in their class this year. So I think it's going to call on colleges to really look at their mission and to say, who do we want to enroll, and what are we going to prioritize in doing that? Melissa, did you want to talk about?
Yeah, I saw one question come up in the chat box that I think is a really valuable one that I imagine a lot of people have. What's the difference between test optional and test blind? There were jokes around of all these different terms you could use: test agnostic, test flexible, test questioning, test open. And it means something different at a lot of schools. Test optional is usually if you took a test and you are proud of your score and you want the school to see it, you submit it, but you are not required to. Test blind is generally, we're not going to look at tests, period. However, I would advise parents that if you don't plan to send test scores, double check the financial aid policies of the schools. Some schools don't look at test scores in admissions, but they do consider them when they're awarding merit scholarships. Some states award their financial aid statewide grants using test scores, and they haven't all opted out of that, despite the fact that it's so hard for so many students to take tests right now. So even if a school says, I'm such a Debbie Downer here, sorry. Even if a school says, you don't need a test score to apply, make sure that carries over to their financial aid policy as well.
Well, it's a good point that, it's important for students and families to really understand the requirements and the process at any school they're applying to in depth, and really understand how they're making decisions financially about college admission, and to understand and to ask. We talked about transparency earlier, to ask those questions. Ask the questions of the admission office. This, like the issue of demonstrated interest, of how schools use students' interest, their demonstrated interest in the school through engaging online or in person. Are they using that in their admission review? And those are the kind of questions that students need to ask each admission office. What role does demonstrated interest play? What role does testing play in scholarships or other things? And expect answers. So I'm just looking at some of the questions. There was one. I think there's a question about deferrals from last year, and I'll kind of put a plug in for next week too. We're going to continue this series. We're going to have admission deans be coming on and talking about kind of specific policies at their schools and at their peer schools. And so we'll be able to dig into some of these more kind of specific questions next week. But I do want to address this issue of deferrals that a lot of families that I've been hearing from are anxious about, that a number of students who who took gap years or went and deferred for a year from the class of 2020 will impact the admissibility of the class of 2021. Like, it will be more selective to apply to college. Anybody want to weigh in on that from what you've been hearing, Jeff?
Yeah, so I'll weigh in on two fronts. First of all, I think the numbers are all over the place. I think a lot of places haven't reported the numbers. The Harvard number that came out a couple of weeks ago, I think everybody kind of globbed onto and said, well, this must be happening at every school. And I was talking to the CFO at Penn the other day who said, I don't trust any of these numbers until September 15th, when the ad drop period is over and people have to actually really pay the bill, right? Because everything is in such flux right now that people who said, maybe I'm going for a deferral, have changed their mind. But I think the important part here is that, schools think about enrollment, yes, by class, but they also think about their overall enrollment and their overall net tuition revenue. And that's a very important number for them. So if they're down this year, and all those students will end up being now freshmen next year, that means their sophomore class next year will be smaller than normal. They're going to want to make that up somehow. And yes, I know that they have restrictions on, freshman class sizes and things like that. Trust me, they're going to figure this out because they don't want to have a sophomore class. They don't want their overall enrollment number to go down. Right. Yes, the sophomore class might be smaller, but they'll take a bigger freshman class to make up for that in many of these places.
And this is one of many points in the process where, I would urge the parents and students on the call not to try to out-strategize this, not to try to outthink it, not to figure out, God, how much smaller is the freshman class going to be next year at Duke, and what does that mean for me? There are all kinds of factors involved here. How many people from California next year are going to want to fly to East Coast schools? Maybe that number will be down. We don't know. What about international applicants? And it's really perilous for those of us who are outsiders to try to handicap it. I think that, try to sort of kind of close out that noise and create a list with your child that aligns with their interests and what they're seeking from this experience and is balanced. Maybe throw in an extra school or two on that list that might in an ordinary year be considered a safety if that gives some comfort. But don't try to outthink this and try to do the math as Jeff says on your own. It's impossible.
I totally agree. Thanks for pointing that out. I mean, it's really kind of this idea of control what you can control, right? I mean, how much energy do you put into overthinking this, and when you just need to do a thoughtful search and apply as you would. I would love to come back to a question earlier, and Jeff, maybe you could talk a little bit about this, is this question about early decision and how it's being used. And I mean, I know you kind of also lean into this a little in your book, but what do you see the role of early, and then I'd love for Jack and Melissa to join in, the role of early decision moving forward. Again, I know we don't have crystal balls, but what role does it play now, and how's it going to impact things?
Well, I'm not a big fan of early decision, as you know from the book. At the end, I like many people, I wish it would go away. I actually think schools are going to lean into it even more this year, and here's why. Because in 2008, the economic crisis of 2008 hit in the fall of 2008, just as schools were selecting that class that following year. And what we saw is at that time, most selective schools maybe took 25% of their class early decision. That year, they raised that percentage close to 50% in some cases. And even when the economy improved, they didn't go back down to 25%. So most selective colleges are in the 40s, sometimes over 50% of their class is coming in ED because they like that certainty in an uncertain world. And there's other reasons for it too. Almost all recruited athletes are brought in early decision. Questbridge and Posse and other programs like that come in early decision. So there's a lot of spots filled through those means as well, but they like the certainty. I mentioned this in the book. At Emory, the early decision class costs them half as much as the regular decision class in terms of financial aid. And they're a need-blind school, right? So need-blind schools really like early decision because, again, it gives them that certainty of revenue. So what I think is going to happen this year in an uncertain world, they're going to lean into it as much as they can. Now, at some point, there's only so much of your class you can bring in early. I mean, at some point, you can't go to 80. I guess you could if you wanted to go to 80 and 90%. So I don't think we're going to see that much of an increase, but I think we're going to see an increase. And it's unfortunate because here we are on September 3rd or 4th. Many kids are not even back in school yet. And I keep asking this question, are you going to change your early decision deadline? And everybody keeps saying no. And by the way, Brendan, they always say the counselors want us to keep it.
Oh, not quite. Don't get me started. As you might know, Rick Clark and I have gone rounds on early action and early decision and the role they play, and who they serve and who they don't serve, institution and students. So, Melissa?
Yeah, I would echo what Jeff said, in that I do expect schools to rely more on early decision right now. And I've been surprised that we haven't seen more schools shift their deadlines at least a little bit. Not necessarily do away with early for this year to accommodate everything, all the chaos going on, but push it back by even a few weeks or a month. I mean, there's still time, yes, but I've been a little surprised and frankly disappointed that more schools haven't done that. You know, taking into account the fact that there are lots of schools where the start is delayed, where they're virtual or hybrid, or they don't even know, they don't have a Chromebook yet to go to high school. And college counselors and guidance counselors at schools are doing all of their sessions by Zoom, and getting those recommendation letters in, you know, by early to mid fall just seems like an outrageous ask of anybody right now. Yet at the same time, those rec letters might matter more if your school is pass fail, right? A stellar glowing rec letter could really set you apart if your spring junior and fall senior grades are all P's. It's just hard to stand out in that. So again, this was kind of perhaps a missed opportunity by some schools to acknowledge things are really strange right now. Let's adjust. But as Jeff said, they want certainty. And just as much as families and parents and students and applicants want a guarantee, they want some method in this madness, the schools want that guarantee too. They financially need that guarantee.
Well, and
Yeah,
some of it's
one thing I heard the other day. Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff.
I was just going to say really quickly, and some of it's workflow too. I mean, in terms of, you know, I've worked in admissions, and some of you have sat in on admissions committees and things, and it's more about spreading out. It's, you know, it's about spreading out applications and getting a sense for their class early. And so, Jeff, what were you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. The other thing they again say about the counselors is they know it's like November 1 in most cases, and so they don't want to change the deadline. I did hear the other day, which will be kind of interesting. Somebody said maybe we'll add an ED3. They already have ED1 and 2, and maybe they'll add an ED3 as a way to give people some certainty. But to be honest with you, they better start announcing that stuff pretty soon, because again, it's September 3rd or 4th, right? You have 2 months to get all this stuff ready.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think people are kind of pivoting. I think, first of all, we should just say early decision for those who don't know is early decision is the binding application process where you commit to attend if you're admitted. And there are, as you all know, there are many early decision policies. There's early decision 1. A lot of colleges have already had early decision 2 or are adding it because of the pandemic. There is ED3. There's some schools that have what's called rolling early decision. So you can pretty much decide at any point in the process that you will commit. So, you know, it's a lot for families to figure out. Jack, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would say that just for the parents on the call, and forgive me if this sounds naive, but listen to your child in this fall that is going to be utterly unlike any other. If you know, one of the risks of early decision that's binding is that you might get in and you've made a commitment to go. And if your child is telling you that they're not ready on November 1st to make that kind of a decision in this climate, I think that's an important data point. And you may feel as a parent, for strategic reasons, they've got to play their early decision card, as it's sometimes referred to, which is a horrible phrase. But if your child is telling you, I can't make this binding decision at this moment in this year, you know, perhaps it's an opportunity to think broader about what this is ultimately all about for them and for you.
I mean, if there's one takeaway in tonight, it's listen to your kids. Like, let them help guide this process, especially given everything going on right now. Yes, they're 17 years old, many of them, but ultimately they do often know what they want or what they need.
And I think it's worth saying that a lot has changed, but a lot hasn't changed, right? I mean, a lot has changed about the way we look at schools and the testing and things like that. But a lot hasn't changed about the need to ask important questions about why you're going to school and what you want out of the experience, and what kind of meaningful search you're going to do.
And at this moment where so much seems out of our control as parents and students, there's still plenty, to your point, that is within your control. The schools that go on that list and why, what your child chooses to write about in their essay and why, the teachers they select to write their recommendations, as was mentioned. I think anecdotally, those recommendations from teacher and counselor are going to be even more important this year in the absence of testing to predict, can your child do the work? But focus on those things that are constants and that are within your control.
Yeah, I do want to clarify one thing from earlier about when we were talking about testing and financial scholarships and things like that. We were talking about, most of you talking about testing. Some schools require standardized testing for awarding merit scholarships. And that is for merit scholarships, not need-based aid. Just want to make sure people understand that. Somebody pointed that out. So, okay, we're getting down to the 8 o'clock hour here. I just want a lightning round for each of you, and I'm going to give you 3 questions, and have you just kind of go all 3 of them at one time. One question is the thing that surprised you most in your reporting for your book about college admission. The next question is, what is one of the biggest, what's one of the biggest myths about college admission? And then finally, what's one piece of advice you give to seniors kind of approaching this, or even juniors approaching this process now? Got all this? Melissa, you want to start?
Sure. Thing that surprised me in my reporting was the lack of oversight of athletic recruiting for those non-revenue sports, and just how much sway being a recruiter, even a walk-on, for say volleyball or sailing or women's rowing, just how much power that can have in the admissions process, and how little the admissions office really checks up on any of that. Myth is that college admissions is a meritocracy, and you can read Jack's Gatekeepers or Jeff's book to remind yourself of that, that it is not pure meritocracy, and there are some wonderfully qualified candidates who just don't get in. Advice to seniors or juniors for that matter is to try not to pay too much attention to what your friends are doing and where they're applying and what they're getting caught up in. It's very hard, of course, but if deep down you think a community college is the right path for you, even though everyone else is heading to a 4-year school, that's okay. That's really okay.
Yeah, as Rick Clark likes to say, get outside your echo chamber.
Yes.
Yeah. Jack, do you want to go next?
Sure, and I'm probably the only one of the panelists old enough that I had to write down the questions.
I saw you writing them down.
Remember them.
I was going to remind you.
Old habits die hard. That's my cognitive test. In terms of what surprised me most, this book sort of drilled down the college conversation on the process and conversation between student and parent. I guess that we need to be careful of the concept of fit. And that people equate fit with perfect. I got to find my fit. I got to find those rays of light that will come down as I go through the gates. And I think what surprised me is that that word can be a bit perilous for those who think that it might be, that there is a perfect out there. In terms of one of the myths, I'm going to cheat a little bit with Melissa's myth. I think the idea that for students and parents, this process is a referendum on merit, whatever that definition means, and particularly for us as parents, that an admission to a brand name marquee school that our neighbors know is a referendum on our parenting and a gold seal on that. And I think we need to be careful, just as those whose children do not get into those institutions, parents should not feel that they've come up short. In terms of a piece of advice, for the parents on the call, set ground rules early, have that conversation. What's your role going to be? What's their role going to be as students? Co-create it, put it in writing, refer to it, and live by it as you both keep an open mind.
Great. Jeff?
Probably the one thing that surprised me was the breadth and depth of the applicant pools at highly selective colleges. I think most of us have an understanding of what it means to have 30 or 40,000 applications. We probably have an understanding of where our child or where we as an applicant kind of fit in within our high school, and then just repeat that across the country and across the world in many cases. There was a moment when we were at Emory looking through applications, and I really felt like, didn't we just see these kids? Because they all, after a while, seem the same. They all have great test scores. They all have great grades. They've all done a million activities. And I just don't think that most parents and students who think that admissions is unfair, and yes, it is unfair, it was never meant to be fair, is the breadth and depth of the pools. The greatest kind of misunderstood thing is, I think, the SAT and the ACT, people think it matters more than it really does, even at schools that require it. And it's really unfortunate that parents and students are like driving around the country, flying around the country, doing whatever they can to get that test score, because they just, and this goes back to the transparency thing, they just don't believe test optional, right? And I kind of get it. If you don't really understand the system and that you think schools are not telling the truth all the time, then you're going to try to do that. But you know, we know this from the NACAC surveys of admissions deans. I've seen it, Jack has seen it, Melissa's seen it, right? They're going to look at grades and curriculum. They always have. Test scores matter, but they don't matter as much as I think parents and students do. And then finally, in terms of the advice, 100% agree with Jack and Melissa. And I think this idea that when you start the search, or even when you're in the middle of the search, stop for a second and forget about the names. Start to figure out what you want out of college, right? And do you want a big school? Do you want a small school? Do you want a rural school? Do you want a city school? Go to some of those and just get the vibe of it. Forget about the name of the place. Just go and check them out. One of your local schools down the street, just to get a sense of it. Check out the course catalog. Check out all these other things. Forget about the names. I think we get so caught up on these names. Forget about that for a while. Figure out what you want and then go after that. I know that's an easy thing to say when you're outside of it. You know, my kids are in elementary school, but it's really disconcerting to me that that most students think there are 10 or 15 schools out there when there are thousands, and thousands, by the way, that provide very good educations.
That's a great point. I'll just add one more piece from me, and that's gratitude. And the idea that, you know, especially folks who are probably watching this webinar tonight, you know, that you get to do this, right? And that that's something to be grateful for, and to share that gratitude with the people who are supporting you, and parents with your children, and children with your parents, and your counselors and teachers. I am grateful for the three of you and these amazing books you've written, and I hope people will go right out and purchase them all. And I've put a link to them there in the chat, and I know the Grown and Flown was sharing them on Facebook as well. Thank you for all you do. Next week, as I mentioned, we will be back with college admission leaders, and we will have the VPs for enrollment from Cornell University, from Howard University, and from Westminster College in Utah. So some really great perspectives, and I hope you will join us. We'll send out the registration for that as a follow-up to this. And thanks for all the reporting you do, and for the good advice you've offered tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Be well and stay well.
Bye.